The controversy, though, comes in, do we give them a topical NSAID to use? And for a while, the prevailing consensus was no, because NSAIDs increase the time it takes to heal, and we want these patients to heal. However, some sources do support the use of outpatient topical NSAIDs, and that would include the American Academy of Family Practitioners, as well as the American Academy of Ophthalmologists. So if the ophthalmologists say it's generally okay, then I think I'm comfortable with it. So some sources do discourage it, citing increased healing time and abuse, but traditionally these are used. It is technically off-label to prescribe a patient with topical NSAIDs for outpatient use. So I would recommend avoiding, if you're in test-taking purposes, I would recommend not doing it because it's off-label. I would recommend just discharging them with a PO NSAID and a PO oxycodone acetaminophen for breakthrough pain. But in real practice, it's very commonplace for practitioners to send patients home with a limited dose of the topical NSAID. And you're going to see this in most cases. So it's one of those off-label uses that's very commonly done. But for test-taking purposes, in general, it's good to avoid off-label treatments. And then in addition, you'll want to give the patient education. You should avoid exposure to the sun while it's healing.
Yeah, my guy.
Use UV filtering lenses in the future when they're going out skiing,
You went away.
or snowmobiling, or whatever they're doing. And if the pain hasn't improved after 48 hours,
I don't think you were around when I wrote your name
and
at the top of the piece.
Photokeratitis, as well as a lot of the
Do
other
you see it
keratitis, they tend to
over there?
heal relatively quickly. So, I mean, some of the other keratitises will usually need antibiotics, but when you're talking about photokeratitis, just superficial lesions to the epithelium, and also when you talk about corneal abrasions, this doesn't take long to heal because the cornea has a very quick cell turnover time. So if the pain has not improved after 48 hours, you definitely need to reevaluate the patient.
Trying to get a good angle for this.
One thing I did want to bring up. If you work in a high altitude environment, you may see this more because UV light increases by 4% for every 1,000 feet. So if you compare New Orleans or New York, which is at sea level, to Denver, which is about 5,000 feet above sea level, people in Denver are exposed to about 20% more UV light than people on the coast. And also people in Denver tend to be out, because they're in the mountains, they tend to be also skiing and doing winter activities like that. So if you work in a high altitude environment, then you should be acutely concerned about this because it's far more likely. All right, with that said, we'll see you next time. Hello everybody, we're going to talk here about preseptal and orbital cellulitis, which are some skin and soft tissue conditions that are of importance in ophthalmology. This is going to be of particular importance to you if you work with the pediatric population, both pediatrics and emergency medicine, but it does happen in adults as well. This is something that's very commonly tested on the USMLE and for good purpose because these are common conditions, and orbital cellulitis in particular is an emergent condition. So these are pretty important to understand. So there's just two that we're going to talk about, preseptal and orbital cellulitis. You need to understand the difference between the two. This is some anatomy here, and don't worry about all of these little details. What I want to point out is this very pertinent structure
It's going to be pertinent in what we're talking about for our purposes, and this is the orbital septum here. And the orbital septum is just a thin fibrous tissue that extends from the orbital periosteum down to the anterior portion of the tarsus of the eyelid. And it's this orbital septum that actually will confine a preseptal cellulitis from extending into the orbital cavity. And so that's why preseptal cellulitis is not quite as severe as orbital cellulitis, which surrounds the eye and all those important structures. So it is this structure here, this orbital septum, that's of importance for keeping preseptal cellulitis where it is and not extending further into the orbital cavity. So here's the sinuses. This is going to be important because sinusitis, infections in the sinus, especially the ethmoid sinuses here in green, have a tendency to extend and cause orbital cellulitis. So these sinuses, they're important to know where they're at so that you can percuss them, because if there is tenderness in these sinuses, it will indicate that there's likely sinusitis, and sinusitis is very highly correlated both with preseptal and orbital cellulitis, especially orbital cellulitis. So we'll start with preseptal cellulitis. This is a common infection of soft tissues anterior to the orbital septum. It's confined by the orbital septum, and it includes all that skin around the eyes, so eyelids and surrounding soft tissue, and it's marked by what we would expect in cellulitis with bacterial infection, and that is edema and erythema, as well as warmth if you were to feel it. Remember your cardinal signs of inflammation: rubor, pallor, dolor, etc. So this is a bacterial infection, primarily staph and strep, as well as Haemophilus influenza type B. And we don't see preseptal cellulitis as much as we used to 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And the reason is because of the HIV vaccine. So we immunize babies now with the HIV vaccine, and that prevents them from getting Haemophilus influenza type B infections, and that has since reduced the cases of preseptal cellulitis. Usually, preseptal cellulitis will antecede a upper respiratory tract infection, particularly sinusitis. It can also come after any eye infection like dacryocystitis or blepharitis or conjunctivitis, and spread from there to the preseptal tissue. Primarily, this is a disease of pediatrics. 80% of preseptal cellulitis cases are in patients under the age of 10, and the majority of cases are in children under the age of 5. I should add that there are a couple other things that can cause preseptal cellulitis in addition to these common culprits, staph, strep, and HIV. It can also be caused by smallpox. Smallpox has been eradicated in the U.S., so it's not really a concern. And it can also be caused by anthrax, but the only reason I add that is because in the age of biological terrorism, anthrax is out there, and it's worth knowing that as a pearl of wisdom. So, some risk factors, of course, the upper respiratory tract infection and sinusitis tend to precede preseptal cellulitis. A concurrent varicella infection has been demonstrated to increase the risk of preseptal cellulitis. And then patients who have asthma, nasal polyps, usually nasal polyps are associated with asthma anyway. That's also associated with preseptal cellulitis, or an increased risk of preseptal cellulitis. And then